Or yeah, nice.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us here today. Welcome to the NERI's 8th annual lecture in honour of Dónal Nevin. My name is Tom MacDonald. I am the co-director of the Institute. I want to especially welcome Maura and Anne Nevin. I understand you will be watching here today and we're delighted to have you. With my co-director Paul McFlynn, I would like to thank my colleagues Louise O'Brien and Paul Goldrick-Kelly for their hard work in putting this event together. And I'm delighted to welcome our esteemed speaker for this year. Professor Cormac Ó Gráda is well known to everyone within the Irish economic community. His A Rocky Road book is obligatory reading for all economics undergrads, or at least should be. Professor Ó Gráda is an Irish economic historian and Professor Emeritus of Economics at UCD. He's written about the economic history of Ireland, the Great Irish Famine, and the history of the Jews in Ireland. In recent years, his research has focused more on the history of famines generally, and on Britain before and during the Industrial Revolution. Cormac has held visiting positions at, among other places, Northwestern University, University of British Columbia, and Princeton. He served on the editorial boards of multiple journals, has written 7 books, at my last count anyway, is a former trustee and a fellow of the Cliometric Society, and is a member of the Royal Irish Academy. So Professor Ó Gráda's lecture is entitled The Irish Economy After a Century. Cormac is going to speak for around 45 minutes, but we won't hold him to that. And we will then conduct a question and answer session. And just to be clear, the chat function isn't working. Don't raise your hands. Put a question through the Q&A function and say who you are if you are doing that. If you're interested in tweeting, it's #NevinLecture. I am now going to hand over to Cormac, who will give this year's lecture. Thank you, Cormac, and good luck.
Thank you, Tom. I'm delighted, it's a great honor. I didn't know Dónal Nevin well, but I did meet him on a few occasions, and I also contributed a chapter to his big mega volume on Jim Larkin, which I'm showing you here. And he invited me to dinner once. I think it was in connection with the publication of that book. The late Emmett Larkin, who was an expert on Jim Larkin, was there. The late David Fitzpatrick was there, and speeches were made, and it was a great night. So this is indeed an honor. It's a pity that we can't do it in the flesh, as it were. I don't particularly like this medium. But we're stuck with it. I guess it's better than the alternative of no Nevin lecture. So we're in the middle of a period of commemoration here. And I thought that since books have birthdays and ambushes have birthdays and discoveries have birthdays, why shouldn't economies have birthdays too? So what I'm offering is a kind of centennial perspective on the Irish economy. It's a bit picky, but there are, I think, there's plenty of ground to cover, and easily enough for the 45 minutes or so I've been allocated. So I thought I'd begin with something that's very topical at the moment, and that is pandemics. Because there is a sense in which there was a pandemic in Ireland, a very serious one a century ago, and we're in the middle, or hopefully beyond the middle of another one now. So let me begin by just making a few comparisons between those two pandemics. And I hope you can all see the screen here. So we're beginning with a comparison in terms of deaths. You can see that the flu pandemic was much worse. The people it targeted tended to be different. They were disproportionately young adults, whereas COVID attacks the elderly, and people aged 85 and above account for something like 2/5 of all deaths, but they're only 2% of the population. In terms of treatment, like for the most part, at the beginning, they're similar. So you have non-pharmaceutical interventions. There was no cure for COVID at the beginning. In terms of the regional incidence, there are differences too. Today, the story is that there have been more cases and more deaths, particularly in Cavan, Carlow and Louth, and then the incidence is lower in other places. And the pattern is kind of random. There isn't a clear geographical pattern to it. Whereas with the flu pandemic of a century ago or so, there was. Again, in terms of socioeconomic impact, it's been said that COVID, and I'm quoting here from a task statement, lays bare pre-existing inequalities. The issue hasn't been studied as much as it should, I think. In 1918, 1919, it's probably true that the poor were worst hit. Now, how has Ireland been doing, and how did Ireland do in comparative perspective in 1918, 1919, and just now? So these are pretty much up-to-date numbers of deaths. And you'll see that, and then the numbers in brackets are per thousand population. So if we stick to COVID and look at that column first, you'll see that Ireland, with its 4,000 deaths, has actually been fairly lightly hit compared to my selection there of Western countries. It's done a good deal better than the UK. And the worst of these countries you'll see there is Belgium, where 0.2%, that's 0.2% of the population, has died of COVID. India, we're talking about 1 per thousand, so it's very, very small compared to the countries listed above. And globally too, we're talking about 0.4 per thousand. When you compare the numbers in brackets with a century ago, on the whole, there's a huge gap. You know, what we're experiencing now is very slight compared to what people had to put up with a century ago. But again, if you look at Belgium, that statement isn't as true. So proportionately, the great flu pandemic of 1918, 1919 killed twice so far, twice as many people as COVID has done. And the reason for that is that Belgium had a good flu pandemic, as it were. It escaped lightly, whereas it's done very badly in the current pandemic. India and China accounted for nearly half. No, that's not true. India accounted for a third, a fourth of all deaths during 1919. We're talking about maybe 40 million in total. But now India is escaping very lightly, and various experts have been asking why that is so. Now, one reason is that the age distribution of the Indian population is very different. I have the number with me here. I think it's it's 0.4% of the population is aged 85 and above, whereas in Ireland it's 2%. And that difference, that demographic difference, would account for a good deal of India's advantage here. It's also true that India's population may have, from previous infections, it may have built up some immunity to COVID, which those of us in Europe and North America lack. Now, I mentioned that the geographical spread of 1918, 1919 was quite different to what we see today. And you see there's a fairly strong east-west gradient here. County Clare virtually escaped the 1918, 1919 pandemic. We're not quite sure, but what this map suggests is that maybe it was because it was remote. It's not, most of it is not near any main rail line. The spread of the infection seemed to travel along railway lines. That is what this suggests. So the contrast spatially would be between Dublin, which was worst hit, and Clare, which was least hit. And I'm thankful to Frank Ludlow of Trinity for allowing me to use this very fine map. So let's now move to some comparisons between then and now in terms, measures, if you like, of economic progress or economic well-being. And first of all, if we compare GDP per head a century ago and now, we have a 16-fold increase. However, that is misleading, and it makes more sense to focus on consumption per head. And there the growth has still been very substantial. People consume on average at least 7 times as much as their grandparents and great-grandparents did a century ago. In terms of population, there has been substantial growth. You'll see here, this is all Ireland, and then I give the Republic as well. So population has grown from 4.4 to 6.8 million for the island as a whole, from 3 to 5 million for the Republic. That is impressive. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but another important change, very dramatic change, has been in the average lifespan, which has gone up from the high 50s in the 1920s to well over 80 today. So it's not just a question of people consuming more on average, but living longer and consuming more in that dimension as well. Now, we see there that consumption has gone up 7 times, but that does not mean, of course, that we are 7 times as happy. And there is really no way of measuring how much happier on average we are. Cultural historians have gone to Monaghan for an answer to that question, and they often invoke Patrick Kavanagh's Great Hunger. And if you were to believe them, the country reached a low point in 1942 when Patrick Kavanagh's Great Hunger was published. Now, one can do better, perhaps. There are surveys of happiness. And what those surveys show, of course, is that we have information. We don't have information all the way back to the 1920s, but what they show is that happiness has not risen in tandem with consumption. Making comparisons across countries is very problematic, if only because the word sunna or happy has different connotations, it seems, in different cultures. So Danish, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian words for happiness, in those countries, they seem to register in different ways. But arguably, there is something to be said for comparing the proportion who say they're happy over time in any given culture. And that's what we're doing here. And this here compares the proportion who say they're happy or very happy according to a Eurostat survey, which has been carried out twice a year since, as well, we have here since Ireland joined the EU in the early 1970s. And when you look at this, and we're comparing here Ireland to Denmark and the Netherlands, one thing that comes across is that Ireland is generally less happy than those two countries. But then I would enter the caveat about different cultures and different connotations. The other point is, though, that the short-term movements are kind of plausible. Here we have a drop in the proportion who say they're happy during the fairly grim period from the mid-1970s until the beginning of the Celtic Tiger period in the late 1980s. So that rings true, as does the growth in happiness in the following 2 decades or so, that is during the Celtic Tiger period. And then we have a bit of a downturn, and in the last near decade or so, there has been a recovery. But having said that, the movements from year to year seem to make sense, the overall sense you get is that there is no sustained growth. There is no growth that lasts in the proportion who say they are happy. Now, this is taking a broader perspective, and it's comparing Ireland, which is the thick band here in green, with a whole range of other European countries. And you see that, again, this is widely remarked on. Denmark is always at the top here. And, you know, if you were to believe what people respond in Italy, Italy is the least happy country in Europe. It nearly always is. Now, I'm not sure whether we have to accept that that is literally true. But again, you'll see that Ireland is kind of average, and there is no sustained increase over time. Now, that does not mean that we would be just as happy if we went back in some kind of time machine to the 1920s or 1940s and to the levels of consumption people experienced at that time. The point here is that an increase in wealth makes us happy for a while, but we adjust our expectations and we're back then. It's a kind of a treadmill. So the happiness adjusts to what we have. One point that this study of happiness tends to agree on is that what matters to people most is not so much how much they have, but how much they have relative to others, where they stand relative to other people in their community. Now, this may have to do with shame. It may have to do with a sense of fairness. It may have to do with jealousy. It may have to do with envy. But the point is that this is a fairly consistent pattern that is observed. And of course, what it means is that if we want to improve aggregate happiness, probably a good way of doing that is to reduce income inequality, so that, you know, we have fewer poor people who are feeling really miserable because they're so far away from some kind of average at any point in time. Okay, so let's move on here. And you know, I'm an economic historian, and I'm afraid that numbers like these are grist to my mill. I hope I don't bore too many people with them, but they are necessary to get some kind of comparative perspective on where Ireland was, where Ireland is relative to other countries. So what I've done here is given you Irish income per head or GDP per head relative to a whole lot of European countries. And then we're setting Ireland here in the middle at 100 in red. And if you look at the first column, the first person really to draw attention to this kind of perspective was Professor Joe Lee of UCC and NYU, who has now retired and is back in Ireland. But Joe Lee pointed out that before independence, Ireland wasn't a miserably poor place by contemporary standards. And he said there were lots of countries in Europe that were about as well off as Ireland was. And that is borne out. These are not the numbers Joe uses. These are the numbers associated with the so-called Madison Project, work that the late Angus Madison did on historical national accounts. And you'd see that at that time, in fact, Ireland is a good deal behind the UK. So, you know, the income per head in Ireland is only somewhat slightly more than half what it is in the UK. But Ireland is like Sweden, it's ahead of Spain, it's like Norway, and it's not that far behind Germany or France. And that is the point Lee was made. So the Madison numbers actually tend to back him up. But then if we move forward, if we fast forward to the 1950s, and I'm going to talk in more detail about the 1950s later, you will see that Ireland has fallen behind and that the gap between most of these countries and Ireland has widened considerably. If you then move further forward to 1985, and this is at that kind of nadir, pretty much before the Celtic Tiger, Ireland is also very far behind. And in this league table, Ireland is 11th. But by 2018, of course, this straddles the Celtic Tiger period, and then there's the crash and the recovery. And this is using GDP per head. Those numbers show Ireland is second only to Norway in 2018. But I show you those numbers only to say that maybe I shouldn't have shown them to you, because really what you need to do nowadays with Irish national accounts is forget about GDP and focus instead on something like household consumption. And I suppose we can take a leaf here out of Adam Smith's famous saying that consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. And when we do that, then Ireland is not at the top of the league table. It's better than it was in 1913. And it's also true that the gap, if you like, the range, the spread today is a good deal less than it was in 1913. Okay, so the gap between the top countries and the bottom countries here in 1913 is much wider than it is in 2019. So the point is, Ireland has done, over the long haul, it's done quite well, but it is by no means at the very top like those GDP per head statistics would suggest. Okay, so let's make that kind of point in another way that economic historians are prone to do. And what I'm showing you here is a series of graphs using the same countries. But what we're doing here is we are relating GDP per head in this case, in 1926, and economic growth per annum in the period between 1926 and the 1950s. And the presumption here is that if countries converge, then those poorest to begin with will grow fastest. And it turns out that during this period, and we're talking here about a period that straddles the Great Depression and the Second World War, that pattern shows itself only loosely. But if you extend from 1926 to 1985, then it works. You see that a line drawn through these countries is a good fit. But there are some exceptions. And the exceptions are Norway on the one hand, which is, as it were, overperforming. Even though it's fairly rich to begin with, it grows faster than you'd expect. And then Ireland, Spain, and Greece are underperformers. And I suppose in this picture, Ireland is the worst performer of all. So if you were to look at the economy from the perspective of the mid or the late 1980s, you would be inclined to say that Irish economic history since independence had been a failure. Ireland had underperformed relative to pretty much every other country in Europe, except you might say Spain and Greece. Now, if you do the same exercise for the whole century, okay, from 1920 up to now, then Ireland has made up the ground it lost in the period up to the 1980s. So Ireland was falling behind, if you like, between the 20s and the 80s. But then in the last 30 or 40 years, it's made up. So if you simply forgot about all the economic history up to the 50s and up to the 80s and treat Ireland as a unit over that century, then you'd say Ireland is a normal economy. The Irish economy grew just about as fast as you'd expect it to, given the presumption that countries converge. Now, this is another way of looking at Irish relative performance, but now here we're talking about life expectancy. And I'm not going back as far as a century ago, because the data that I could conveniently lay my hands on go back to 1960. And these are World Bank data. And Ireland is the thick band here. And you see I have a whole spread of countries, and I don't want, this is not done so that you can identify these countries easily individually. It's just trying to give you a sense of where Ireland is in the pack. And what this suggests is in 1960, Ireland is near the bottom. Ireland, life expectancy in Ireland is around 70, but in the best performance, it's 74. And Ireland, I suppose, on average is 2 or 3 years behind the average. Now, Ireland stays at the bottom. And in fact, at this point here, around the year 2000, Ireland is lowest. Life expectancy at birth in Ireland is lowest of all these countries. But since then, and this I have to say, for reasons that we don't yet fully understand, maybe this is some kind of dividend that is due to the Celtic Tiger, which had already been in progress for a decade or more. Maybe it's because something the Public Health Service did. Maybe it's something behavioral, that people adopted healthier lifestyles. But since that time, life expectancy in Ireland has kind of shot up. And now Ireland is, in terms of, just like it is in terms of consumption, in terms of life expectancy, Ireland is not a poor country. It's not mega rich either. It's just a normal European country. So let's move away from long-term patterns. And I'm going to talk briefly about nadir's, crisis points, and crisis periods. And so these years here these are rock bottoms, if you like, for the economy. 1958, I've talked about already. 1947 comes at the culmination of a really bad period during what for other countries was World War II. For Ireland was the so-called emergency. And then the economy also hits a low point in 1933. And this is during the so-called economic war, which I'll talk a little bit more about now in a minute. And then we would also add here 1989, we've talked about already. This is a bottom before the Celtic Tiger takes off. Now, so to begin with, in the 1920s is economically a fairly gloomy period. It's not one of a downward spiral, but nevertheless, wages fell. The living standards of most ordinary people probably declined. It's also a period during which emigration was high. So independence was no economic panacea. On the other hand, and again, we have to put the 1920s in some context, the newly independent economy did not experience hyperinflation like a lot of newly independent economies did. It's also true that the regime at the time established a kind of a reputation for creditworthiness, for fiscal responsibility and what have you. And again, Ireland is one of the, a minority of countries in Europe which stayed democratic right throughout the interwar period. And a lot of the newly established economies after World War I, the same could not be said for them. But it also has to be said that the regime from fairly early on did not court popularity, and I suppose was committing political suicide. The Cumann government of the 1920s up to 1932 prided itself on being anti-populist and on catering to, I guess, a particular kind of middle class, big farmer electorate. And so I have a few statements here, which I think typify the kind of esprit, the ethos of the Cumann leadership in the 1920s. So you have, first of all, Kevin O'Higgins, who was murdered, but who very early on in a Dáil debate prided himself and his colleagues on being the most conservative revolutionaries than ever put through a successful revolution. And he may have said that with an eye to foreign audiences, reassuring them that this was not by any means a red or even a pink revolution. Then you had Ernest Blythe arguing that to cut sixpence off the income tax might lead to an immediate loss in revenue, but that he had no doubt but that in a year or two, the yield would improve so as to meet the loss. So this is Ernest Blythe's version of what would become known in the 1980s as the Laffer curve. You reduce tax rates and you increase tax revenue. There's very little evidence anywhere in history for that being the case. But it also gives you a sense of Ernest Blythe, you know, taking a shilling off the old age pension, but at the same time cutting the income tax that the very well off would have to pay. And then you have Oliver St. John Gogarty, who did not sit in the Dáil. He sat in the Irish Free State, Shannon, describing the old age pension as an alien imposition under which persons who are not really deserving received pensions. And you can imagine what the tens of thousands of elderly people, a lot of them I would argue, and most people at the time argued, were deserving, thought of that kind of statement. And finally, we have here Patrick McGilligan declaring that people may have to die in this country and may have to die through starvation in a country, you know, still with, if you like, a kind of a folk memory of the Great Irish Famine. This is late in 1924, and sure enough, some people most likely did die of literal starvation in Ireland, but only in remote places in northwest Connemara, around Roundstone, the Clifton area, and also then in southwest Connemara, out in the area called an Irish Nahilloin, out towards Lettermore and Lettermulloin. And the hardship in the west of Ireland was highly publicized in the late 20s and in January 1925, which caused Patrick Hogan, who was another pretty right-wing Fine Gael minister, to declare in the Dáil on February the 13th, 1925, there is no abnormal distress in the West this year. I say that definitely and deliberately. There's always distress in the West. But this is at a time when couples in the West are being deprived of their kids, who are being sent to industrial schools at the insistence of the ISPCC, and where, you know, people again are resorting to famine foodstuffs that they would not normally consume. And we're talking here about a very small section of the population. Nevertheless, it was there. On to the economic war. Now, the economic war was a period of hardship, and one of the main reasons for that was that cattle prices plummeted. This is not, it's a kind of a, you know, a cold war. Nobody dies, but there is hardship between 32 and 37. And then there is a a settlement in 1938 and peace is restored. I don't have time to go into it in much detail, but enough to say that there was political unrest. This was a very bad period for farmers, but because food was cheap, it was a good period for urban workers. There was hardship, but there was no, I think, excess mortality. One of the difficulties, perhaps, is because there was the sense that Fianna Fáil won the economic war, and certainly their leaders insisted on this. Two of their big vote getters in Dublin, Sean Lemass and Sean McEnee, positively chortled about having won the economic war. Sean T.O. Kelly made a speech during the election campaign in 1937, claiming, this is on Manor Street, which is Stoneybatter, that we had won all round us and wiped John Bull left, right and centre, and with God's help we will do the same again. So Fianna Fáil were on the crest of a wave, and of course they did not realize that they won the economic war, because this was a very particular situation. And in different circumstances, the UK could have inflicted far more damage than it did, and indeed it would inflict that damage in the following years during the emergency. So the emergency was a really difficult period in Ireland, and there are, various ways of highlighting that. The message I take home from the economic war, and this is a bit of a cliche of mine, that no economy is an island, not even an island economy. But if you want to kind of think in terms of what represents the economic war, I have two little measures here, kind of quirky measures. One is rabbit exports. These are data for rabbit exports in the 30s, 40s, until it is destroyed by the industry is destroyed by myxomatosis in the mid 1950s. But in 1941, rabbit exports account for 3% of all exports in an economy in Western Europe, and that is, I think, one for the record books. And then again, we have information exceptionally on the exports of as obscure an item as frachans, or what used to be called in my youth in West Cork, where my mother was from, black hurts. Over 60,000 days of work were put into collecting frachans in Ireland again in 1941. Now, the emergency was a real emergency in Ireland, so much so that you can see it reflected in demographic data. Here we have what happens to TB death rates. They go up during the emergency, whereas they fall in Britain and in Northern Ireland. Infant mortality rises during the emergency, particularly in the cities. That is what the long marks here, that's what that shows. And you can see again that whereas in the rest here in Northern Ireland and in GB, there is a falling off in the crude death rate. In Ireland, if anything, the crude death rate rises. And I think there is a case to be said that if we use Northern Ireland as a benchmark and do the arithmetic, so the thick line is south, the other line is the north, and you can see that they're rather similar up to the beginning of World War II, and then a gap opens up. The war is good for the economy of Northern Ireland, is disastrous for the economy of the south, and that is reflected in the numbers of deaths. And you can do a kind of a back of the envelope calculation, and I think one could argue, one wouldn't want to swear to it, that up to about 5,000 people died of various reasons, not necessarily starvation, but of infectious diseases, infant mortality and the like between 1942 and 1945. Something else that might be said about that period is that, of course, consumption dropped. The consumption on fuel and light in particular, in real terms, dropped disastrously. And I think this is what people would have felt most, particularly in the cities. There was a tremendous shortage of fuel. And of course, expenditure on clothing also fell. What did not fall, and I think this is something that would be worth further investigation, is spending on booze and tobacco. That rose somewhat in real terms. And there may have been, as a result of that, some intra-house distribution towards men who smoke and drank, and away from children and women who tended not to. And this would be a reflection of what is called in the literature the breadwinner wage, where, you know, the only income in the household comes from the adult male, and the rest then to some extent are dependent on the adult male for what they get. And then, of course, in the wake of the war, you get a huge rebound, and this is the kind of thing people talk about in the wake of our present difficulties. You get a big increase in spending on consumer durables, on clothing, and on other goods between 1945 and 1949. But that cannot last. And the next thing is what you know, economic historians refer to as the lost decade of the 1950s. And I don't have time to go into that because I'm going to allow myself another 10 minutes or so. I'm going to skip some of the slides fairly quickly. If only here I will show you another one of those convergence diagrams. But this is taking the period from 1958 up to the beginning of the Celtic Tiger. Now, we often think of that period as a good period economically, and it is when you compare it to the dismal 1950s, and indeed the sum of the period since the 1920s up into the 1950s. So if you compare the Ireland of the 60s and 70s to the Ireland of the pre-1960s, it's good. But if you take a comparative focus, and I think Irish economic history should be more comparative, then using that standard, Ireland here is a real outlier again. It's underperforming in this period. And I think there is a lot to be said what Mary Daly has argued in her work on the 1960s, in that we have hyped the 1960s as a period of recovery. The answer there is yes, compared to the 1950s in Ireland, but the achievement is really modest by the standards of the rest of Europe. Then we get into the post-oil crisis period, and that is like a really dismal period. And there is, this is a quip of mine at the time. Keynesianism was in the air, and I think a lot of economists then would have argued that the Keynes, who was supposed to have reached Kinnegad in the 1950s, should have stayed in Kinnegad during the 1970s and the 1980s. But the bottom line then is that when Joe Lee published his book in 1958, in one sense, his time was unlucky. But looking back, he could claim that Irish economic performance has been least impressive in Western Europe, perhaps in all of Europe in the 1920s. And I think that's true. But then if we fast forward up to now and we look back, not from the 1980s, but from now, then Irish economic performance over that centennial perspective has a sense of normality about it. I'm going to skip that. I want to make a few north-south comparisons. And I find this kind of interesting. These are two, if you like, quotes about, first of all, the state of the northern economy and the southern economy in the mid-50s. And this is from Iles and Cuthbert. who made a statement about the Irish, the Northern Irish economy. They reported to Stormont, and their report was so negative that the Stormont administration for a while kept their survey under wraps. But they say that it's hard to resist the conclusion that that Northern Ireland is worse off than it would have been if this semblance of self-government were removed. So they argue at that point that the Stormont devolution experiment, economically, if not politically, was a mistake. And this is a lot like what T.K. Whitaker argued. And this is in a statement to the incoming Minister of Finance in 1957, James Ryan. Whitaker tells Ryan in a memo after 35 years of native self-government, people are asking whether we can achieve an acceptable level of an economic progress. But since that time, I think it's fair to say that the Southern economy has done better than the North. And I'd say this not in any sense of self-congratulation, but just setting out the fortunes of the two, and the very different histories they've had. One way, of course, of looking at this is to compare the Northern Ireland share of the population of the island as a whole. So it's gone up all the time from 1870 up to 1990, but then since then it's fallen from 34% to 28%. That is a very, very dramatic change. And again, you can look at this here. This is the confessional perspective, and you'd see that the proportion of people of a Catholic background fell from nearly 40% in 1871 to less than a third at the time the Northern state is set up. And in fact, that was the rationale for the Northern state. But then it has increased since then, and it has increased very dramatically in recent decades. I think this is also just in terms of a quirky comparison between the two economies. You may not recognize these gentlemen. This is Henry Ford, and this is John DeLorean. And I put them up there because in the late 1920s, Henry Ford set up a manufacturing plant in Cork, which for a brief period was the biggest employer in the Irish Free State, and then tariff protection paid to that. Ford hoped that Ireland would operate a lot like multinationals in the South and in the North have operated in recent decades. In other words, as a setting off point to the rest of Europe. But then with protection in Europe, that could not happen. Still, it's worth comparing what Ford did to what DeLorean did fleetingly in the late 1970s. He also was brought in, he set up a plant which employed a max of 2,500 workers. But DeLorean produced something like 6,000 cars in all during the lifetime of the plant. Ford cost the Irish Exchequer nothing. DeLorean cost His Majesty's Treasury 80 million, which is the equivalent of about 13,000 per car, which was, as it happens, the sale price of the cars, $25,000. So all, if you like, the cost of the cars was paid for by subsidies. Again, we can compare North-South today, using the South as equal to 100 and measuring consumption. Today, consumption in the South is a little bit higher than in the North. GDP is less, and then consumption is higher in Britain, it's higher in Scotland. So that goes back to the comparisons I was making at the beginning. Now, I want to end on one note, And because this is, I think, it's both a reflection of the success of the economy in the last few decades, but it is also something that has changed Ireland to wax poetic utterly in the last few decades. And that is, Ireland has become, instead of a nation of emigrants, a nation of immigrants. Since the turn of the millennium, Ireland has had more immigrants, relatively speaking, than any economy in Europe. And you can see that first. This is in the period up to 2012, and Ireland is way ahead of anywhere else except Spain. And then the graphs on the right show Ireland, again with the long marks here. Ireland is ahead of everywhere except briefly Austria and Germany during the big influx of Syrian refugees in 2015 and 2016. So that is, it sets, Ireland has been a massive recipient of immigrants. Now, the other thing to be said about Ireland, and that is in a way surprising, even though Ireland has received proportionately more immigrants than anywhere else, and one can say this more about, I think, the South than the North, again. Ireland is the only country in Europe, with one or two possibly exceptions, where there isn't a xenophobic anti-immigrant party. And I'm singling out here Portugal and Spain as maybe warnings to Ireland, because in a way, Ireland has made a success of the way in which it has welcomed immigrants. But you look at Portugal, as recently as October 2019, the xenophobic party of the day, this Partido Nacional Renovador, got 0.3% of votes. In the presidential election, and this was last month in Portugal, Chega, which is the direct descendant of this kind of party, got 12% of the vote. In Spain, if you look at opinion polls before October 2018, Vox, which we all know now, got between 0 and 3%. In the April 2019 election, Vox got 10%. And in Catalonia last week, where, you know, Vox is that kind of party, would have been poison, it got 8%. And nationwide in Spain, the most recent polls have Vox at 18%. And you can see in both cases, Chega has let us make frontiers, has built walls, if you like. So the rhetoric is very Trumpian. This fellow, Abascal, who's the fairly charismatic, unfortunately, leader of Vox in Spain, says no to the invasion. We need to defend the frontiers of Spain. So the only countries in Western Europe, as far as I can see, that don't have that kind of party are Iceland and Ireland. But Spain and Portugal act as kind of warnings to us. This is something which may not last, so we shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back. On the contrary, we should be, I think, very cautious and not pursue policies, not make statements that would change where we are now. But it is, I think, a mildly optimistic note to end this talk on. I've gone on for a bit too long, so I'll call a halt there. As I say here, Shin Shin, Gurumina Makov. Thanks a lot. Okay.
And thank you, Cormac, for a very stimulating lecture. Very, very interesting indeed, to me at least. And I do have some questions from the audience.
I can stop sharing the screen, I guess. Yeah.
Great. So I might do 3 questions at a time, if that suits, or we can do them one by one, but we'll try three at a time for now, and we'll see how we go. So just a very, very quick question, first of all, from an anonymous attendee. Are the people living in slum conditions in India covered in your COVID statistics? Second question from Kieran Nugent. What lessons, if any, can Ireland take from the experience of the economic crisis that followed the financial crash of 2008 in dealing with the fallout from COVID-19? And the third question for now from Eric Conroy is, will Professor Ó Gráda address the need to move beyond seeing GDP as a measure of success in the era of climate change and rising inequality in the world? So one short one and two slightly longer ones there for you, Cormac.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. I suppose the slums in India are implicitly in one of the tables, because I said on the one hand, India has not been badly affected, and that is good news. The bad news, of course, is that in India, like everywhere else, the pain is unequally shared, and probably the poor are more affected during the crisis like they are in normal times. I mean, I accept that. I wouldn't be an expert, so I'm not going to bluff my way through the COVID in India, but I would take it for granted that, you know, the hardships that people experience in normal times would be intensified during the crisis. I'm not sure what the financial crisis and the current crisis, I think, are very different. And I think that the path to recovery will be different. Now, part of me wants to take refuge in a criticism the late Donoghue Corráin made of his colleagues in the history department in UCC some time ago. It was a very fractious history department, and O'Corráin, who was a medievalist, accused all his other colleagues of being journalists and not paying enough attention to the past, and writing op-eds and pontificating about the present. Now, of course, we want to pontificate a bit about the present, but I deliberately did not talk about the current crisis, except insofar as it gave me a way of talking about the 1918 pandemic. And there are people who are much better qualified to talk about how we get out of the current crisis economically. But obviously what is being mentioned is that interest rates are very low, and that hopefully, you know, those people who have been forced into doing a lot of saving in the last year will spend that money. So that is really all I want to say about that. On the issue of climate change, I will, like, in a way, I suppose I should apologize to not mentioning that, but I would, I suppose, in my own defense, say that probably for most of the period I was talking about, like this is history and we're talking about the last century, climate change wasn't an issue until the last few decades. And you know, if you think in terms of the ecological, environmental damage that was done over that century, most of it, the bulk of it, is in the last decade or two. And that is why we're much more conscious of the issue, I think, in the recent past. It's something that tended to be ignored. I mean, one, you know, if one did pay attention to it, then one might have been much more critical in the 1960s and the 1970s about what Bord na Móna was doing and how much we relied on turf for energy and what have you. But, you know, I take the point as a policy relevant point, of course.
Thanks, Cormac. That's fair. Two similar-ish questions first from Luke Callan and then again from Kieran. First of all, would it be fair to say that xenophobic fascist parties develop quicker in countries that have colonial imperial traditions, whereas Irish nationalism has generally been anti-imperial? And then a related question, anti-immigration sentiment is growing in Ireland, as we've seen recently. You mentioned Portugal and Spain there, two other countries with similar experiences of the financial crisis. Are these sentiments linked to economic conditions and security? And if so, what can policymakers do to address this anger? And then third question, somewhat differently, well, very, very different, as from Sean Byrne. Why did it take 30 years after independence for Irish governments to make economic development a priority?
Yeah, these are all great questions. So, yeah, I mean, I suppose the question about immigration and anti-immigrant attitudes reflects the fears I would have. And I wouldn't take for granted the situation we are in now at all. It's one I'd worry about. If we can keep that situation the way it is, if we can celebrate where we are, but not risk stoking any fires of racism, I think that would be good. Why are the Irish different? I would not make a virtue of it, because I don't think, we will necessarily be different in 10 or 20 years' time. Why are we different? Does it have to do with anti-colonial sentiment? I'm really not so sure. And there is something to be said here. I had to go over the slide fairly quickly, but if you remember the second or third last slide I showed, I used the word salience. And what I meant by that is, it's not that the Irish don't have the reservations that people in other countries have. It is that they don't put them at the forefront of the things that worry them most politically. So it's not the biggest policy issue. During elections here, and this was certainly true during last year's election, none of the main parties mentioned immigration. There were one or two candidates, individual candidates, who did this, and they tended not to do well. And that was fantastic. It is not an electoral issue, but at the same time, when Gallup or the like, European Social Survey, when they ask Irish people, do you think having a lot of Irish immigrants in Ireland is good, bad, in between? Irish people tend to answer pretty much the same as people in France and Spain and Germany and Denmark and everywhere else. It's a bit like, and I'll use here an expression which I used to hear when I was growing up. It is not the biggest bead on the rosary of Irish people, Níl Sér and Gluchas Mór and Badring. It's there, but people in other countries worry about it much more. It's something that they bear in mind when they vote. In Ireland, so far, there is no electoral mileage to be gained from beating the anti-immigrant, the xenophobic drum. Long may we keep it that way. And then Sean Byrne asked me, and I can't remember exactly what the question was about.
Sean Byrne asked why it took 30 years after independence for Irish governments to make economic development a priority.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I would argue that economic growth did not happen during the 20s. I would accuse the government of that day of a lack of imagination and being too cautious. But it's maybe too short a period to judge the economy on. Then the 1930s, and this is something my friend and colleague Kevin O'Rourke would also highlight, the 1930s is a fairly miserable period most places. And then the trouble is that I described in a way the victory of the economic war, and Fianna Fáil doing very well in the wake of the economic war. And then the emergency afterwards. Those two events, the emergency and the economic war, tended to hide the fact that being completely self-sufficient, relying on protectionism, relying on the home market, was not a way of allowing the economy breathing space to grow. And that was a lesson that was, I think, took a long time to learn, because these factors. You could say the economic war was political. World War II was another external shock, but it's externally driven, if you like. And had there been no war, had there not been the incident we know as the economic war, economic growth would probably have set in earlier, and we would have become more like the rest of Europe sooner than we actually did. We wouldn't have to wait until 1960 or so.
Very good. I have a few questions here from Owen Flaherty. He asks, well, first of all, he says this was a great talk. Many thanks. And then he asks, do you have any idea on why there has been so little focus on the Spanish flu? Second, how good is the Madison data in your opinion? Third, compared to Ireland, to what extent are other European countries' share of immigrants masking the level of first-generation nationals that have had difficulties integrating, is how he puts it. And four, do you have any ideas on what Ireland should be doing to ensure we ensure social cohesion between non-immigrants and immigrants in the future? The Madison question in particular is interesting there.
Yeah, yeah. So now the first question was
about Spanish flu. Why does such little focus on Spanish flu?
Now, among historians, there is a bit of a literature on why people forgot the Spanish flu, and there isn't an agreed answer. And like if you do, let's say, a search on JSTOR on scholarly references to the Spanish flu, there are very, very few before, let's say, the 1980s. And then some historians became interested in the Spanish flu because of later flus. And they thought, oh, maybe if these later flus change, if they mutate, then we may be back to 1918 once again. So there was some mileage to be got from writing books about the Spanish flu. But the first author who wrote a mass market book on the Spanish flu had to change the title of the book in order to make it sell. You know, he had some historically relevant title. I forget exactly what it was, but the book got nowhere. And then he kind of said, "Will this happen again?" You know, and the book began to take off. So it's only when the Spanish flu seemed to be kind of relevant again that lessons might be learned from the experience that had caught on, and that public health experts, historians, epidemiologists, economists became interested in. That's so much so that now there are journals that are devoted just to COVID. You know, on the Madison data, I am happy enough with the Madison data for the 20th century. But if you try to make a case about, you know, whether Belgium was richer than Ireland back in 14 AD or even 17 AD, I would say, you know, forget about it. And the trouble is that some people take Madison's numbers at face value and come up with all kind of ambitious interpretations of global economic history based on what are known as Mickey Mouse data. So the question is useful, but I think that the work done on historical national accounts for the 20th century, and you know, people have done some on Ireland back to 1926. There are estimates for Ireland for the period just before World War I. And people are now trying to push back into the 19th century. And that is good. I mean, we do need numbers like that. They should always be issued with a health warning. And I also like to use information like that with a kind of a confidence into it and say, give or take 10%. Don't take these numbers literally.
Yeah.
Now, as you know, the question about the first generation new Irish is well put, and of course, if you take them into account, then it makes the impact of immigrants on the population, on the culture, even I think more striking. And there are issues there, and you hear subtle ways in which people try to avoid interacting with immigrants, living with immigrants, sharing sporting facilities with immigrants. I wouldn't want to exaggerate how much that goes on. I think there is a lot of good going on. And we see now how some of our greatest athletes are of they're new Irish, or they're of mixed Irish immigrant parentage. And that is absolutely fantastic. We see some Indigenous Irish people now doing very well, not just in soccer, where it's been happening for a while, but in the GAA. And there are, lots of club players now in the GAA, and you get particularly underage, a lot of that going on. On the other hand, you do hear stories of parents trying to avoid having their kids in schools where there are lots of immigrants by sending them to Gaelscoilne. And that is something that I would, as a Gaelgoer, I make no apologies, that is something that I would worry very much about. And I think that Gaelscoilne have an important duty to emphasize that their mission is not to keep out the new Irish, but to insist on high quality education through Irish for everybody.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Cormac. A point very well made. So 3 more questions then. First, from Nessini Cassada. Do you see a significant connection between Ireland's FDI model and corporate tax avoidance via Ireland currently? And if so, what implications do you think this has for Ireland? Next is Paul Sweeney. Was Fianna Fáil's nationalist policies the main reason why Ireland was late in opening up after World War II to enjoy the gains from the European post-war boom? And Alison Gilliland, what have been the key landmarks that have allowed women participate more equally as actors in our economy? So 3 very different questions there.
The question on FDI, like on the whole, I think FDI has been good for Ireland, and I think Ireland has been lucky. It's been lucky for 2 reasons or 3 reasons. One is that it was very early into this particular game. Another reason it was lucky in that in an EU context, Ireland, the Irish economy is very small. So Ireland could afford to give multinationals tax breaks that if, say, France or Germany or Britain had tried to do the same, they would not have got away with it. So Ireland had the advantage of being small. And I think the other way in which Ireland has been lucky in that at the outset, it tended to attract fairly low-tech industries, which were fairly far advanced in their product cycle. So the plants that were set up in Ireland were basically assembly plants, which were set up purely to avoid taxation, and where the work was not skill intensive at all. But I think really in the new millennium, say in the last 20 years or so, the multinationals are really a different animal. They are, of course, there still is a lot of unskilled work, and now that's true not just in manufacturing, but in the service sector. So, a lot of the multinationals are involved in marketing and what have you. And a lot of the work is, fairly low paid and unskilled. But I think it's also true that an increasing share of the labor force of the multinationals is skilled and white collar and very well paid. And you only have to think of, in particular, Google and Twitter and so on. They're paying their people well. That is not to say that they are here for our good. I think the first thing you have to think about capitalists always is that they are greedy. They're here. They're serving their own interests, and of course they are avoiding taxes. And Ireland has. I am afraid to say I think Ireland is and has been a tax haven. And that is going to cause increasing problems for the Irish economy in the future. So we have to try and think of ways of holding on to our multinationals, attract more foreign direct investment, but at the same time not alienate both the US, where this is an issue obviously, and not just with Trump, but also our partners in the EU. Now on the issue of women, I'm really sorry that I had so little to say about women explicitly. I suppose the only graphic in which I did allude to women is in terms of life expectancy. And that is one area where, you know, if you go back to the beginning of the Free State, back to the 1920s, men and women tend to live about the same from birth. And they both do badly by European standards. And I should have said maybe that actually is interesting, because if you go back to Ireland before the famine, Ireland was desperately poor, but life expectancy in Ireland was relatively high by European standards. And that was because of the potato, which was a health food. But then Ireland fell back in the post-famine period, so that once the economies of the two Irelands start, Ireland is towards the bottom of the life expectancy league table, and women do badly in Ireland relative to men. Today, women live 3 or 4 years longer on average than men, and I think that is, you know, it's not the whole story, but I think it is some kind of measure of how women have been progressing relative to men.
It's great. And just, there was Paul's question as well.
Oh yeah. Hi Paul. Paul's a friend of mine. So he could have asked a harder question, I was expecting.
He could have done.
Yeah. But anyway, there is this issue of, is it all down to Fianna Fáil in the post-war period, and there is the question of who started FDI, and I think that the difference between the two at that time has been exaggerated by some people for party political reasons. I think it's true to say that Lamass, before 1948, was already fed up to the gills of Irish business. And he was saying they were rent seekers. All they want to do is to sell to the Irish public at high prices. They sell them shoddy goods, low quality goods. They refuse to dip their toes in foreign export markets. And he, in his just negotiations with the forerunner of IBEC and the FII, I've seen the correspondence, he needles them and he says, look, I'm giving you guys a great time and this is not going to last. And why don't you try and be more ambitious and export more? So there is that sense, I think, by, let's say, 1950, once the post-war recovery is over, that this cannot continue. And like you will get Dan Morrissey, who was one of the ministers in the first inter-party government, and he outdoes Fianna Fáil in his reassurances to business. He said, business is safe with me. I'm not going to impose any kind of trade liberalization on you. So I think everybody was in the game on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think there were progressives in both Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil who wanted to encourage companies in that would not compete maybe with the companies who were already there. And that was the very clever thing about bringing in the multinationals. If you could bring in multinationals who would cater to the foreign market, not the home market, then they would not threaten the vested interests who were already there. So what was done to begin with was not to give tax advantages, but to give capital grants to firms to come in. And then eventually that shifted towards tax relief. But, you know, I think that Of course, there's something to Paul's question, and I think one could highlight certain individuals, like I have maybe, and say they have been more enlightened and more progressive on this issue. But I think the main point is that from the early mid 1950s, it was quite clear that the economy was a basket case, that one couldn't continue. Even, trade unions, the Labour Party, none of them could any longer put up a credible argument in favor of protectionism. So the most they wanted was that the companies where the workers made their living in would be given some kind of respite period while they prepared for free trade. They were given that period, but most of them did not make it.
We're up to 4:20, so I'm going to do questions one by one now, just so you don't feel too pressured on time. But first of all, Blair, well, in this case, Blair Horan asks, to what extent, if any, did the abolition of the Corn Laws, 1870s deflation in agriculture, hold back the southern economy that it took EEC to cap and export subsidies to rectify?
Yeah. Good. Yeah, I'm an economic historian, so that this kind of stuff is my bread and butter. There is a sense in which, if you go back to the period when the Corn Laws are in operation, and that is up to the time of the famine, one could argue that the Corn Laws made Irish farmers grow more corn than the country was really fit for. And, that it was a bit like the Common Agricultural Policy, again, high prices, diverting Ireland away from what was its comparative advantage. I mean, and of course, the same happened during the economic war. Fianna Fáil wanted to help small farmers, and they thought the way of doing that was to subsidize labor-intensive activity, which would be tillage, but not just of oats and barley, but of wheat, for which Ireland really never was suited, but also tobacco, for which Ireland never was suited. But the idea was that this would create employment. Now, when you have the period between the famine and independence, or between the famine and 1932, Ireland was a free trader. And during that period, of course, Ireland becomes a specialist in milk, butter, bacon, and live cattle. And that's where its comparative advantage lay. And unfortunately, this was not very labor intensive. And the difficulty then, once Britain begins to subsidize its farmers, is that Irish farmers are at a disadvantage because their prices are artificially reduced. And that continues during World War II into the 1950s, until the Common Agricultural Policy again gives Irish farmers high prices. And that has a very dramatic impact on Irish agriculture. It probably did, to some extent, delay the retreat from farming. And but in the long run, if you think forward 10, 20, 30 years ahead, Ireland, I think, is going to have to, I suppose, and the EU will eventually move towards free market in food and stop subsidizing small farmers. I mean, there are historical reasons, but as the farming sector becomes smaller and smaller part of the whole economy, why we should give farmers a particular ride and not, say, the hotel industry, the tourist industry, or whatever other industry, one's pet industry is not clear to me.
Very interesting stuff. David Jacobson asks a very interesting question, a counterfactual question. If all the support for multinational corporations had instead gone to indigenous industrialization, is there a chance that we would now be a successful economy, but with more indigenous exporting companies? Example, with active selective industrial development policies.
Yeah. Great question. And again, we're into the realm of what might have been, maybe to a lesser extent, what might be. I mean, it's sometimes pointed out that of all the firms set up under protection from the 1920s on, because Commonwealth did introduce some tariff protection, but hardly any of those companies survived beyond the 1970s. I mean, there are very few exceptions. Smurfit would probably be the most famous, and it did that by morphing completely. Changed very, very radically. It could perhaps. It's not like the indigenous sector at the time did not look very much for that kind of help, did not show that kind of imagination. I don't think was possessed of that kind of talent. And this is one of the points that struck me. If you look at Ireland, say, from independence up to the time of Joe Lee's book, and you try to think of who were the great Irish entrepreneurs of that period, it's very difficult to think of any. You think of a few maybe in the semi-state sector, like Costello of the sugar company, maybe Todd Andrews of the Turf Development Board, Namona, but they're not operating on a level playing field. They're being subsidized. But who among the indigenous private sector guys stands out? I can't think offhand now. I can't think of any. Whereas if you move forward into the post-1980s period, there are lots. But the thing is that a lot of them actually make most of their money, employ most of their labor force outside of Ireland. And you think of Michael O'Leary, O'Reilly, Naughton, and there are many, many more. And of course, the Irish economy, it attracts capital in, but a lot of its entrepreneurs actually, they go and they share their expertise abroad, So I don't know. I think maybe it took multinationals, it took the opening out to create those kind of people. They weren't there in the period before. And I think maybe there is something to be said for the fact that in the period before free trade, I think the public sector attracted the best brains in Ireland. I know when I finished, and I'm old enough to be, towards the latter end of protection, the beginning. The best job you could get in Ireland was either third sec in foreign affairs or becoming what was known as a junior ad in the Department of Finance. Those were the jobs one went for. You were not thinking of your 600 points for medicine.
Yeah.
You went for those jobs. And that is, I think, maybe it's telling you something about the kind of people who were attracted into industry or had been attracted into industry before that. And also of maybe a waste of talent. Maybe there were too many people. I worked in the civil service for a year. And I really was struck by, I was surrounded by geniuses, the kind of people who now would be off working for multinationals or making a fortune as lawyers or what have you. And again, that's a measure of how the country has changed. But I'm gathering on. Sorry about that.
No, not at all.
Again, I should say hello to David Jacobson, who's another.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm gonna leave you with one last question, and apologize to everybody else because there were far more questions that I could possibly ask. And the last question, and maybe just a short 60 seconds or slightly more, but from DTNI and then from G. Murphy, presumably Garrett Murphy. First, and they're very similar questions. Northern Ireland continues to follow the same policy as the DeLorean example, albeit on a smaller scale. What advice examples would you give policymakers in the direction of an alternative economic policy? And then the other question is, what does our experience of two distinct economic systems on this island in the past century have to offer the Irish economic planners of the present century? And I'm so sorry, time is very, very short. So succinct, short responses, Cormac, if at all possible.
Yeah, well, I think on the issue of the same policies towards multinationals, I think like Northern Ireland was just unfortunate in that the Troubles scared off multinationals. And while they were being scared off in Northern Ireland, the South was beginning to attract the kind of multinational that has been so successful here in the last 20 years. It was during that period that those multinationals began to come here. And of course, the South then builds up a kind of a niche for attracting pharmaceuticals, computer technology, information technology, and so on. And unfortunately, the North isn't at the races at all when it comes to that. And that is one of the big costs of the Troubles. I mean, one hopes that eventually that kind of deficit can be made up, but you know, we talk about, say, you mentioned I work on the Industrial Revolution in England, and the Industrial Revolution turned the English economy upside down. The North had been the poor area before the Industrial Revolution, and by the mid-19th century, the North of England is where it was at. And now again, a century and a half later, it's the other way around again. But like the Troubles, I think more than independence, but the Troubles have in a way turned the Irish economy, or the two Irish economies, upside down. So the North now is, you know, by Southern standards, unfortunately, a bit of it's laggard, it's a bit of a backwater, and the South is doing well. And again, the North is heavily dependent on the public sector, and that is a real problem, and a kind of a millstone around the private sector in Northern Ireland.
Again, Cormac, I'd like to thank you for your lecture, for your excellent, wonderful answers to the many questions. There were far more questions. I can happily send you on additional ones if you like, but it's been a real pleasure, and I could have listened to you for another hour at least, frankly, but we did promise people we'd finish it up at 4:30, so I'm conscious of people's time. It's been an absolute pleasure, a fantastic presentation from a real scholar, and we're very, very lucky to have you, frankly. Of course, this was the 2020 Dónal Nevin annual lecture, and obviously COVID put pay to that, but it's great that the changing technology which we've seen over the last 100 years, and even the technology that's developed in the last 15 years, has really made this possible, and it really does show how life is changing, even if we don't see it on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, we're not 7 times happier, but we do have certain things that we can do which we could not do 100 years ago by any stretch of the imagination. I'd also like to invite everyone to the next NERI seminar. We've Helen Johnston from NESC. She'll be here on the 24th of March talking about the future of the Irish social welfare system. And we'll have Sinead Mercier on the 28th of April, looking at 4 case studies on just transition, lessons for Ireland. So I hope you'll join us for those. And I'd like to just say on behalf of the NERI, my thanks. I'm delighted you were able to do this. You were a coup for us to get. And thank you. And I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there then, and wish you all a good evening. And see you all next time.
Good. So thanks a lot.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.